Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mind, was the tabby cat he had spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same marking around his eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was that a normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problem with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into his living room in the time to catch the last report on evening news. And finally, birds watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls were normally hunted at night and hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscasters allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now we're to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owl tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I promised yesterday, they have had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks. But I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks over the places, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He would have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she replied sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in the town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he did tell her he would have heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually he could, their son, he wouldn't be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty common name if you ask me. Oh yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to the bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to the pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He could see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no reason of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of the privet drive. It didn't so much as when a car door slammed on the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as thought it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in the street where everything from his name to his boot was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he didn't seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for in his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer until the only lights left on the whole street were two tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly the shape of the marking at the cat had around its eyes. She too was wearing a cloak. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How do you know it was me?" she said. "My dear Professor, I have never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day?"